that introduction. It's because it gives me an opportunity to remind you that the first large-scale digital computer in the United States was a Navy computer operated by a Navy crew during World War II. And recently I've been finding that I have to remind people of that because there's been a tendency on the part of a certain junior service to try and claim credit for those early computers, and they didn't even exist yet. So please remember that it was a Navy computer. And if you're wondering why I kept my cap on, I had a reason for that too. It's because this is my identifier. I hope you all know by now that every record in a computer system must have an identifier. That's so you know where to put it and how to get it again. There's something odd about those identifiers, though. They have to be understood both by the person that originally puts it on the record and the person who later looks at the record. That's where my problem has been. I go wandering around airports and people come up to me and say, "When's the next plane leave for Houston?" I got totally demoted one night in San Francisco. I got off an elevator, and there was a couple in the elevator with me. As I got off, I heard the woman say to her husband, "What was that?" "No, you haven't heard the worst of it." He said, "That was a security guard." So then I went up to Canada to speak at the University of Guelph, and I had to go through immigration at the Toronto airport. So I handed my passport to the immigration officer, and he looked at it and looked at me and said, "What are you?" And I said, "United States Navy." He took a second real hard look at me, and then he said, "You must be the oldest one they've got." Now, I didn't really feel that was a polite way to welcome visitors to Canada. But the only put me down I could think of was to say, "No, Admiral Rickover is 6 years older." And I don't think he even knew who Admiral Rickover was. But if you know what I am, I'll take my cap off. That only goes to show my white hair. Actually, I can remember when Riverside Drive in New York City, along the Hudson River, was a dirt road. And on Sunday afternoons, as a family, we would go out and sit on the drive and watch all the beautiful horses and carriages go by. In a whole afternoon, there might be one car. Cars were enormously expensive. They were individually built. There was no such thing as gas stations. If you went on a long trip, you got 5-gallon cans of gasoline, put them on the back deck, strapped into the car, and took your gasoline with you. If you broke down in the middle of Utah, you wired back to the manufacturer. Then he sent a man out with a part. Then he worked on the part till it fitted your car. Then along came a gentleman named Henry Ford with two concepts: standard interchangeable parts and an assembly line. And he started to build Model Ts. I think we've totally forgotten how tremendously that changed the world. You could have any color you wanted as long as it was black. They cost between $300 and $600, and people started to own cars. Naturally, once they had cars, they demanded roads. We built them. Gas stations appeared. Garages could stock the interchangeable parts. They appeared. People found they could move to suburbs and drive to work. Then, of course, they wanted to shop near home, so we had to build shopping centers. I think we've forgotten the tremendous developments that followed from the Model T Ford. Now, whether you recognize it or not, the Model Ts of the computer industry are here. We've been through the preliminaries of the industry. We're now at the beginning of what will be the largest industry in the United States. And I'm quite worried about something. When we build all those roads and the shopping centers and all the other things and provided for automobile transportation, we forgot something. We forgot transportation as a whole. We only looked at the automobiles. Because of that, today when we need them again, the roadbeds of the railroads are falling apart. They're dumping polyvinyl chloride around the countryside. If we wanted to move our tanks from the center of the country to the ports to ship them overseas, there are no flat cars left because we move all the cars on those racks on the roads now. If we wanted to move coal to replace oil, There are probably not enough hopper cars to move both the grain crop and the coal. And the truth of the matter is we've done a lousy job of managing transportation as a whole. Now, as we come to the world of the microcomputer, I think we're going to be facing the same possibility. I'm afraid we will continue to buy pieces of hardware and then put programs on them, when what we should be doing is looking at the underlying thing, which is the total flow of information to any organization, activity, company, or what have you. We should be looking at the information flow and then selecting the computers to implement that information flow. Now, of course, if we do that, one of the first things we'll need to know is something about the value of the information we're processing. It's close to 8 years now that I've been trying to ask people how they valued their information. I've gotten the finest assortment of blank stares you ever saw in your entire life. They even questioned whether there was a difference. Naively, I thought I could find out how people were valuing their information if I could find out how priorities were assigned on the computer systems. Boy, did that go flat fast. I found out exactly how the priorities are assigned. Top priority goes to the senior squeaky wheel, not to the most valuable information. Some people even questioned that there was a difference in the value of information. I use as an example a chemical plant I know up in Michigan that's totally operated by computer. Information comes in from marketing, goes to the computer. It opens valves, pushes stuff through pipes, tells inventory what it's made. The people are paid by the computer. Nice computerized reports go up to the president's desk. Now let's suppose that two pieces of information enter that flow simultaneously from two different ports in the system. One comes from a valve out in the plant and says, if you don't open me, the plant's going to blow up. You have less than a minute in which to act, 100 lives at stake, $100 million chemical plant. At the same instant, in another part of the system comes the fact that Joe did 2 hours of overtime. Which is the more valuable piece of information? And what are our criteria? I've mentioned 3 possible criteria. The time in which we have to act, the number of lives affected, the number of dollars affected. I think there's a 4th, the importance of that piece of information in making decisions. No work, no research has been done on the value of information. We've completely failed to look at it. And yet it's going to make a tremendous difference in how we run our computer systems of the future. Because if there are 2 things that are dead sure, I don't even have to call them predictions. One is that the amount of data and the amount of information will continue to increase, and it's more than linear. And the other is the demand for instant access to that information will increase, and those 2 are in conflict. We've got to know something about the value of the information being processed. Everybody wants their information online. If one department gets an online system, then all the other departments want an online system. In many cases, that's a matter of prestige, not of actual need. I played a very mean trick on one activity. I tucked a counter in every record. Every time the record was looked at, I added one. At the end of 6 months, I printed out everything which had not been looked at. One entire file fell out. Yet the owner of that data had insisted that his information must be online. It was a matter of prestige to have his information online, not that he really needed it there. One outfit has taken a second look at the data from that point of view. It's the Coast Guard. They had a file which contained the complete history of every buoy. And when a ship went out to maintain the buoys, they'd look in the file to see what had been done about the buoy over the last couple of years and whether any message had been left to look at something next time. Those records started years ago as a punch card, and they'd gotten longer and longer and longer and longer over the years. The whole system was slowing down, and yet they needed rapid access to it. So they took a second look at those records. And they said, hey, we don't need that whole record online. All we want online is the last couple of years. We don't need to know when we bought the buoy and how much it cost unless we're going in for a budget to get a new buoy. We can have that answer tomorrow or the next day. They chopped those records. The front end of it that they need for reference to go out and maintain the buoy is online. The rest of the record is going back to batch, and you can have the answer tomorrow or the next day. Somewhat the same thing has been done by Tactical Air Command at Langley. They were carrying online for assignment on base the complete record and history of every person. The whole system was slowing down because the records were so long. So they took a second look at the records. And they said, hey, we don't need that whole record when we're assigning a man on base. All we need to know is the last couple of schools he's been to and the last couple of assignments he's had. We don't care where he went to high school. So they chopped the records. The immediate past history is online. The rest of it's going back to batch, and if he's going up for an award or a promotion or something, you can have that tomorrow or the next day. They've begun to look, at least, at the time value of the information. There's been no research in this area. There's no one publishing papers, not even on the relative value of information within an organization. Nobody is looking at the value of information or comparative value of different pieces of information. And we've got to look at it because it's cluttering up our online systems. And we've got to know more about the value of information in order to design the systems of the future. I thought up a couple of curves. I have no numbers to put on them. The research hasn't been done yet. But at least I think I can talk about the shape of them. Suppose this is dollars and this is time. And an event occurs here. Now, the value of the information about that event goes up quite sharply immediately after the event. But the further you get away from the event in time, the more the value of that information levels off. It goes up very sharply, then it levels off. Now, ultimately, it gets replaced by a new piece of information, or we decide we don't need it online anymore, and we transfer it to historical files, microfilm, or something like that. Of course, in industry, they have to save it for the IRS. So the value curve probably looks something like that, a sharp rise, a leveling off, and then an eventual transfer to some form of historical file. What about the cost of that information? The cost of information is very, very low at the time of the event. But the further you get away from the event in time, the more the cost you pile up to store it, maintain it, and add any information to it. So the cost curve starts low, and then it goes zooming up. Now, there's a lovely crossover point there. That's the point at which keeping that information in our online system is costing us more than it's worth to us. But because we don't know where that point is, we have no way of getting stuff out of our online systems. And that depends on knowing something of the value and the cost of the information concerned. We've got a big job to do in investigating those areas. As a matter of fact, we don't even know the possible cost of having incorrect information in a system. This vastly upset Lieutenant Colonel Rendleman down at Maxwell Air Force Base, and he decided to investigate the possible cost of having incorrect information in the system. He found a section in the privacy law. Fortunately, most of our government employees don't know it's there, or haven't found it yet, which says that if you have incorrect information in a personnel file, and if because of it someone's denied a promotion or a raise or something like that, they have a right to sue the federal government. It's one of the very few cases in which the individual is directly given the right to sue the federal government, and it's a very powerful paragraph. Whenever any agency fails to maintain any record concerning any individual with such accuracy, relevance, timeliness, and completeness, boy, that's 4 powerful words, as is necessary to assure fairness in any determination relating to the qualifications, character, rights, opportunities of, or benefits to the individual that may be made on the basis of such record, and consequently a determination is made which is adverse to the individual may bring a civil action against the agency, and the district courts of the United States shall have jurisdiction in the matters under the provisions of this subsection. So he decided to find out how much it might cost to have incorrect information in a personnel file. And he said, let's suppose I have a personnel file on 8,000 people. And he said further, let's suppose that I know the file is 95% correct. He selected things and looked at them and gotten a correctness percentage. Of course, I don't believe there's a personnel file in the country that's 95% correct. But he said, let's suppose it is. And that means that 5% of those records contain incorrect information. 400 of them contain incorrect information. Then he went and talked to the decision-making people and the psychologists and so on, and he says, what's going to be the effect of that incorrect information? And they said, well, it's going to stick out. It probably won't match the rest of the file. Nobody takes any chances on anybody nowadays. We think in 90% of those cases, a negative decision will be taken on the basis of the incorrect information. That would mean in 360 cases, a negative decision is taken on the basis of incorrect information. Then he said, we don't know how many of those people will sue. We have no experience with that yet. So by the laws of probability, we'll have to say it's 50-50. 180 of them sued the government. Now, of course, they're bound to win their suit because the incorrect information's in the file. So he said, let's suppose the damages are $2,000. I think he underestimated that. $100 for court costs, $650 for lawyers. Each of those cases is going to cost us $2,750. How much do we stand to lose because of incorrect information? Well, it turns out that 180 times 2,750 is darn close to $500,000. $495,000. The possible cost of information in that personnel file. Now, to make that computation, the possible cost of incorrect information, we can't make a clear estimate of how much we're willing to spend to correct the file. I now know that economically I can go up to almost $500,000,000 to get that file to a higher level of correctness, because that's what I stand to lose. We've almost never made any computation of the possible costs of incorrect information in the system. One of the things that bothers me is we've talked about data processing for 30 years. We spent all our time talking about the processing, hardware and software. We paid no attention to the data. And yet the data is our raw material. Our output is information, our product. And we should be concentrating on the data and the information. The hardware and software are, after only the tools which we do the processing, and should not occupy the primary position in our thinking. It's high time that we began to turn our attention to the data and the information that we're putting out. I don't know how I'm going to persuade people to do it, but I'll try hard. There were a lot of things that were pushing me toward worrying about all this future business. We ran the Mark computers all during World War II. I thought you might like to know that the first computer bug is still in existence. We were building Mark II the summer of 1945. It was a hot summer in Cambridge. And naturally, since it was World War II, we were working in a World War I temporary building. Air conditioning wasn't very good, no screens. And Mark II stopped. We finally located the failing relay. It was one of the big signal relays. And inside the relay, beaten to death by the relay contacts, was a moth about this big. So the operator got a pair of tweezers and very carefully fished the moth out of the relay, put it in the logbook, and put Scotch tape over it. And below it he wrote, "First actual bug found." I knew you'd be glad to know that the bug is still in the logbook under the Scotch tape. It's in the museum at the Naval Surface Weapons Center at Dahlgren, Virginia. Now, I've told that story a lot of times. It turned out some people didn't believe me, particularly the American Federation of Information Processing Societies. So they made an expedition to Dahlgren, and sure enough, they found the first bug in the logbook under the Scotch tape. So they took a picture of it, and last year in the July 1981 issue of the Annals of the History of Computers, they published a picture of the first bug. And I think it's rather nice that the Navy is keeping a few of the early artifacts, like the first bug and me and a few other things. However, it finally got to be 1946, and each one of us the war was over. Each one of us had to decide what we were going to do next. Now, up to that time, the Waves had all been reservists. In '46, the Navy offered the opportunity for the Waves to transfer to the regular Navy. So naturally, I applied for transfer to the regular Navy. And I was turned down because I was too old. The cutoff age was 38, and I was 40. And incidentally, it's just as well to be told you're too old when you're 40, because you go through the traumatic experience, and it never bothers you again after that. I really recommend it highly. However, I elected to remain in the reserves. Now, back in those days, in the reserves, we had 3 jobs to do: summer training duty, weekly meetings, and take correspondence courses. We had to take correspondence courses according to our designators. I was then an ordnance officer. At present, thanks to the now defunct Bureau of Naval Personnel, it turns out I'm an aeronautical engineer, but I don't worry about that. So I took ordnance courses, and of course the Navy was using up all the old manuals at the end of the war. So I learned all about big guns and gun turrets and everything we were then phasing out of the Navy, though now it may come in handy again, till I ran out of ordnance courses. The only other courses that would credit for my designated were the War College courses. So absolutely terrified, I sent for the first War College course. And they sent me the first problem. I was to fuel a task force at sea in minimum time. And all they told me was how fast the different ships could pump oil and receive oil. And of course I knew nothing about fueling ships at sea. But I had to do something. So I lined up an oiler and a carrier and started pumping from the oiler to the carrier. Perfectly clear that wasn't going to get me minimum time. So I decided they must have given me the rates for some reason. I looked at those, found I could simultaneously pump oiler to carrier and carrier to destroyer. And they'd both be filling up because the rates were different. Now somewhere along the line, somebody had given me a course in problem solving. And they'd told me to always extend every solution. So I did. I started pumping from the destroyer to a corvette. We still had some then. That was all working beautifully. But that course had also told me I must generalize every solution. So I did. On the other side of the oiler, I pulled up a cruiser and a destroyer and a corvette. I ended up with half the task force, all hitched up with lines, sailing down the middle of the ocean. My problem was returned with a comment, an interesting solution. I decided that wasn't the way you fueled ships at sea. Well, along came the next problem. This time they gave me a squadron of submarines, told me scout the Caribbean minimum time. Well, I knew less about submarines than I did about oilers. So this time I called on my friendly computer to help me, and I used a random walk program for each of the submarines. You should have seen that map. I covered it in minimum time. It was beautiful. Only trouble was I had those submarines cutting across each other. They made U-turns, one little circle up here and came back. An interesting solution. I was even beginning to feel some sympathy for the poor guy at the War College that had to read my solutions. And along came the third one, and that was the important one. I was to make a plan to take an island. Then after I completed my plan, I was to make 2 reviews of it. I was to review my plan in the light of all possible enemy actions, all possible future events. And then I was to review the cost of not carrying out the plan. 2 reviews which are critical to any plan whatsoever, yet I keep finding them left off of our plans for computers. We have a very bad tendency to base our plans for computers on the equipment we have in-house and the things we're doing now, and totally fail to review them in the light of the equipment that will be available and the things that we will be doing. I think the saddest phrase I ever hear in a computer installation is that horrible one, "But we've always done it that way." That's a forbidden phrase in my office to emphasize the fact I keep a clock which operates entirely counterclockwise. Now, the first day people meet it, they can't tell time. By the second day, they discover what used to be 10 of is now 10 after, they can tell time again. Normally, it's not till the third day that they recognize that there was never any reason why clocks should run clockwise. They could just as well have run counterclockwise. There's no reason for the hands to go by the digits. I have another clock that has a pointer and the digits go around on a drum. It tells perfectly good time. Of course, by now I have a digital clock, and my helpful crew gave me an hourglass. But they sit there day in and day out and say, never, never, never in this office say, "But we've always done it that way." Now, when it comes to carousels at airports, I can see a good reason why they run this way. That's because most people are right-handed, and that's the way you grab your bag. I still haven't found out why helicopter rotors go the way they do, but I find it rather interesting that we've always done it this way seems to be so much embedded in things. And it's the most dangerous phrase you can use in a computer installation. So hopefully, I'll give each one of you a very small gift. I will promise you something. If during the next 12 months, any one of you says, "But we've always done it that way," I will instantly materialize beside you and I will haunt you for 24 hours and see if I can get you to think again. And I know it works. I've already had over 70 letters thanking me for haunting people. I'll be there. We've got to accept the new things that are ahead. One of the major difficulties is the difficulty of changing people's minds. I had to give a presentation for the EDP Policy Committee of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, all admirals and generals. I had to remind those gentlemen that they've had piles of big reports sitting on their desks that they'd had to read and absorb, big decisions they'd had to make. And they had not had time to keep up with the technology that was changing overnight. And therefore, they were going to have to learn to listen to their juniors. I'm telling all the youngsters, officer and enlisted, and civilian, never, never, never take the first no. There are a certain number of people in business, industry, government, who always say no the first time you suggest something new because they're lazy. And if they say yes, they're going to have to do something about it. But there's another group that are even more dangerous in a way, who always say no the first time you suggest something new or different because they want to see if you believe in it enough to come back and ask again. So never take the first no. Always go back and ask again. As a matter of fact, I take about 4 no's and then I figure out how to get around the guy, but that technique comes with age. I ran into one of these guys during World War II in Buard. After about 2 or 3 suggestions, I noticed he always said no to things the first time. So the next time I went in to suggest something, I said, let's pretend this is the second time I'm presenting this. I said, you always say no the first time. And he looked at me with the funniest expression. I had him over the barrel from then on because I just go and say, this is the 4th time I'm requesting this. Let's just say yes now. So never, never, never take the first no on a new concept. It's terribly important that we listen to our youngsters. Some very interesting things are happening in the Navy. I know one case of a young lieutenant junior grade who went aboard a ship. The Navy thought it was too small to have a computer. He took his own computer aboard. He was an admin. Pretty soon he had all the ship's records in his computer. He was getting all the reports out on time, beautiful, accurate. Everything was just marvelous. When he was transferred, the captain had to buy his computer. I know another case where the commander of a squadron was told to take his squadron out to a carrier. He found that when he did, he would have to leave all his maintenance records in the Naval Air Rework Facility, the NARF. This didn't please him at all. He wanted the maintenance records of his planes with him. So he went out and bought himself an Apple. With the assistance of an ensign and a DP in the NARF, he borrowed, stole, liberated, copied his records from the NARF into his Apple, got a case for it, put it in the space behind his seat, which is supposed to take his suitcase, and flew off to the carrier with all of his maintenance records and a computer with which to keep them up to date. Every commander of every squadron should have that. Somebody said, are you supposed to do that? He said, I didn't ask. I long ago discovered, of course you don't all have the same advantage I have, but I long ago discovered that the best way to get something done was to do it, and if necessary, apologize. It's much easier to apologize. You have no idea, oh gee, I didn't know I couldn't do that. I can turn into the most helpless old female you ever saw. We've got to listen to our youngsters. We've got to do the new things. And it isn't too hard to apologize, believe me. We had another case, a young electronic technician, first class, out in the Pacific Fleet, built a computer. The PR man of his ship thought this was terrific. So he took a picture of the sailor and his computer and put it in Navy Times. Admiral Cullen saw it. So he wrote a letter to the sailor and congratulated him. And he sent it direct through the mail instead of sending it through channels. So the sailor decided that if the Admiral could write him direct, he could write the Admiral direct. And he did. And he thanked the Admiral for his letter. He pointed out he didn't know Admirals read Navy Times, but he was glad they did. He then went on for 10 pages, both sides, single-spaced, and told the Admiral exactly what was wrong with the computers in the Pacific Fleet and what ought to be done about it. It was probably the best survey we'd ever seen. Sir Admiral reached out his hand and said, ET-1 Slater, Pacific Fleet to Norfolk. He gave him 3 more ETs and some DPs, that's our programmers, and some money, told him to build the computer. In 4 months' time, out of off-the-shelf components, they built it. 3 small boxes, database management system and everything, just beautiful. They set them up as the Micro Evaluation Group. It's under the Naval Regional Data Center, Norfolk. They've run every micro in the country and run most of the software. They know exactly what's available and what you can do with it. Anybody in the Navy thinking of getting microcomputers can consult with them, and they'll give them real good, solid help, writing the RFP or acquiring the computer that they need for that job. 3.5, 4 months ago, I've forgotten just when, they put on a seminar on microcomputers. They didn't think they'd really get very many people. They hoped for 100 people. They had to cut it off when they got 300. They got a hall in one of the local Norfolk buildings. They had booths. They leaned on all the micro manufacturers, each to bring in their micro. And they had every one of those micros, I think there were 27 or something like that of them, every one of those micros running an actual Navy problem. So when the Navy came in, they could see the micros doing their kind of problem. They've got some marvelous speakers. Probably one of the most successful seminars on micros I've ever seen, all put on by those young enlisted men. In fact, Slater, who's now chief, has recently written an excellent paper, Everything you ever wanted to know about microcomputers but didn't know who to ask. It's top-notch. You can get a copy from Ardac, Norfolk. Excellent job. All the questions you should ask when acquiring a micro and why the different answers apply to different things. It's top-notch for an individual who wants to get a microcomputer or for a small installation, like our small naval bases and so on that want to get a microcomputer. It's a beautiful job. Contributed a tremendous amount to the Navy. We've got to learn to listen to those young men. They're bright as they can be, and they really know that equipment. And it's true of our young officers and our young enlisted men. We've got to learn to listen to them, because the uppermost people have been much too busy managing things to keep up with the technical developments. There was something else that was driving me toward the future and worrying about the future. When I met Mark I back in 1944, Mark I was 51 feet long, 8 feet high, 8 feet deep. She was in a magnificent glass case designed by Norman Belgettis. And what's more, she had 72 whole words of storage. Each word consisted of 23 decimal digits and an algebraic sign. And, in addition, she could do 3 additions every single second. 3 times every second she could get 2 quantities from memory, add them together, and put the answer back. That sounds pitiful to you today, but if you go back and look at the newspapers and magazines of that period, you'll find that Mark I was the most remarkable tool that man had ever built, because she was the first tool that assisted the power of his brain instead of the strength of his arm, the very first one. She did an addition in 333 milliseconds, 3 additions per second, 333 thousandths of a second. We didn't stop there. There were a lot more computers built during the rest of the war, most of them under contract to the Department of Defense at various universities. Not till 1951 did we have the first commercial electronic computer, and that was old UNIVAC I. And a year ago at the National Computer Conference, they celebrated her 30th birthday. She even got a birthday cake. And UNIVAC I could do an addition in 282 microseconds, 282 millionths of a second, and we were going 1,000 times faster. We didn't stop there. By 1964, out came the first of the CDC 6400s, and it did an addition in 300 nanoseconds, 300 billionths of a second, and we were again going 1,000 times faster. Now, if you're nut about the future, as I am, naturally you have to try and write the next line, see what it looks like. 19 question mark. Well, we need an XYZ system that adds in 300 picoseconds, 300 trillionths of a second for a complete addition, storage to adder, add them together and put the answer back. Another 1,000 times faster. The answer is we need it right now. There are a couple of problems for which we need it very badly. The population of the world is increasing. That means we have to increase food supplies. The biggest assist we could give to increasing food supplies would be better long-term weather forecasts. You may remember a couple of years back they planted corn out in Iowa, Before it was fully rooted, heavy rains came, washed it all out. They had to wait for a second shipment of seed and fertilizer and plant again. It was too late. The early frost got it. If they'd known the rains were coming, they could have delayed the first planting and would have had that crop. Yet we do not today have a computer which will run a full-scale model of the big heat engine which consists of the atmosphere and the oceans. We haven't even tested all of our models. Now that didn't matter till a few years ago. We didn't have the data to feed into those models. The Navy was dropping radio-equipped buoys in the rivers of the oceans to get more information. We were putting sensors on commercial airliners, recorded on tape and took them off when they landed. But now we have the satellite photographs. Those satellite photographs, the Landsat photographs, are so darn good that when they're fully enhanced by computer, we can actually tell how high the waves are out in the middle of the Pacific. We can tell what the temperature of the ocean is 20 feet below the surface. Of course, there's a catch. To fully enhance a satellite photograph takes 10 to the 15th power arithmetic operations. It's close to 3 days on our best computers, and the weather's already happened. Yet we desperately need that information. There's another area in which we're going to need computers. The news magazines, it's one of the, every so often they turn it up. I think the Corps of Engineers worries about it, but nobody seems to really point at it very hard. That's the question of management of water. My sister lives in northern New Jersey. A year ago spring, they were limited to 50 gallons of water apiece a day. And they came around and looked at the water meters, and if anybody used more than that, they fined them. Down in Norfolk, they began to run short of water. Now, Norfolk, city of Norfolk draws its water from wells. So they decided they'd better drill a couple more wells. And they got awful cute about it. They drilled them in the corner of the naval base and thought they'd get away with it. But they were in Suffolk County. So now Suffolk County is suing Norfolk County for stealing their groundwater. Nobody's getting the water, of course. Down in Florida, they drew so much water, they opened huge sinkholes and dumped houses and cars into them. Out in Colorado, the eastern half of the state's dry, the western half has water. So, same thing. So, the easterns think it'd be a ducky idea to poke a tunnel through the Rockies and get water from the western half. No way are the westerners going to give their water to the nasty old easterners. In fact, Colorado, Nevada, California, all those states out there are in the courts fighting over who can draw how much groundwater from where and how much water from which river. Water supplies are going to be one of our major problems of the future. We may even import water from Canada instead of oil. Can you imagine what kind of computer power it's going to take to manage water so that every individual in the United States gets his fair share of pure water? It's going to be one of the biggest jobs we ever tackled. At the other end of the scale, we need the itty-bitty computers. I'm awfully fond of a small town in New Hampshire. They used to have sort of a septic system in a great big open burning dump. Along came EPA and said, you can't do those awful things anymore. We'll give you a large sum of money. You will put in a tertiary treatment plant for the sewage and an incinerator in place of the dump. So they did. They even had a parade with a band and everything when they dedicated the incinerator. They love parades in New England. Then they found they had another problem. Because they took the EPA money, the nice little old lady who keeps the town records, which used to be two lists, one a list of the taxpayers, she checked them off, paid taxes, the other was a list of voters, she checked them off at town meeting. But now she has to report to the township, the county, the state, the federal government, EPA, OSHA, EEOC, IRS, Social Security, government reports. Every one of them is arranged differently and totaled differently. And she's going to have a computer just to get the government reports out. And that's happening to every small business, every doctor, every lawyer, and every small town across the country. We're still going to need the itty-bitty computers. Everything from the itty-bitty up to the great big ones. I said we're going to have some trouble getting there. To explain that, I have to explain something about myself. I'm an extraordinarily annoying employee. I normally drive all of my bosses totally nuts because I won't do anything till I understand what I've been told to do. So when you tell me to do something, I start asking questions till I get a clear picture of what I've been told to do. Well, they told me that first computer was adding in milliseconds. So now I naturally said, what's a millisecond? Well, they told me it was 1,000th of a second, and I had a problem immediately. I could see a second go by on the clock, but darned if I could see 1,000th of it. So I said, please show me a millisecond. And nobody would show me a millisecond. Time went on with me still fussing till somebody stuck a finger on one of my programs and said, hey, you wasted 5 microseconds. And I said, so what? What's a microsecond? Well, they told me it was 1,000,000th of a second. And again, I had a problem. In the first place, I didn't know what a million of anything was. The biggest check I'd ever seen was less than $1,000. I didn't know what a million was, and if I didn't know what a million was, I didn't know what a millionth was, and I fussed and fumed. I wanted to know what a microsecond was. I got nowhere. Pretty soon over in the engineering building, they started talking about circuits that acted in nanoseconds, billionths of a second. Well, that really had me on the ropes, because in the first place, I didn't know what a billion was. I don't think most of those guys up in Washington do either. And if you don't know what a billion is, how on earth do you know what a billionth is? I fussed and fumed. Finally, one morning, in total desperation, I called over to the engineering building, and I said, please cut off a nanosecond and send it over to me. And I've brought you some today. Now, what I wanted when I asked for a nanosecond was, I wanted a piece of wire which would represent the maximum distance that electricity could travel in a billionth of a second. Because it wouldn't really be through wire. It'd be out in space at the velocity of light. So if you start the velocity of light and use your friendly computer, you discover that a nanosecond is 11.8 inches long. The maximum limiting distance that electricity can travel in a billionth of a second. Well, I was real happy with my nanosecond. I looked at it from all angles. I thought about it. I looked at wall switches and counted the distance. Some of those lights went on. Gee, these may have taken a couple thousand nanoseconds. Finally, at the end of about a week, I called back and said, look, I need something to compare this to. Could I please have a microsecond? I've only got 1 microsecond, so I can't give each one. There's a microsecond. 984 feet. I sometimes think we ought to hang one over every programmer's desk so they'll know exactly what they're throwing away when they throw away a microsecond. I hope you'll all get some of these nanoseconds. I've got lots of them with me. They're absolutely marvelous for explaining to wives and children and admirals and generals and people like that. And you may find yourself in a spot where you have to explain why 2 pieces of equipment have to be close together, or explain to an admiral why it takes so damn long to send a message via satellite because there are an awful lot of nanoseconds. It's very effective, he'll believe you. So you may need a nanosecond, and I hope you'll get some. I hope you'll feel free to use this demonstration if you need it. There's only one thing you have to be careful about if you're going to use the demonstration. Normally, I put these in my overnight bag and check it. One day, I put them in my shoulder bag and went down to National Airport. And it took me 20 minutes to explain nanoseconds and microseconds before I could board an airplane. So if you caught them around with you, be sure you check them. I've got lots of nanoseconds for you here. I bet you didn't know nanoseconds came different colors, but they do. But I said I wanted to add in 300 picoseconds. Now, a picosecond is 1,000th of a nanosecond. The best way to make picoseconds is get one of those big pepper grinders, and you can make picoseconds all over the table. 300 picoseconds is going to be 1/3 of a nanosecond. And there's my problem. I haven't got enough distance to get from disk to add or disk to add, or add the two together and put the answer back. I'm beginning to push the velocity of light. Now, Dr. Einstein very carefully explained to us that when matter attains the velocity of light, matter turns into energy. It goes poof. Now, of course, I'm perfectly willing to admit that our bright young engineers are going to get beyond the velocity of light. They're going over into that anti-universe where they have white holes and talk to all the quarks and leptons and gluons and everybody else. But not in the next 5 years. And I need that computer before then. So what am I going to do? Well, I could use my common sense. Except that seems to be the last thing we ever use in connection with computers. Well, if I won't use common sense, maybe I can use history. Back in 1976, we got well accustomed to looking at early history. Let's try that. Now, back in the early days of this country, when they moved heavy objects around, they didn't have any Caterpillar tractors. They didn't have any big cranes. They used oxen. And when they got a great big log on the ground and one ox couldn't budge the darn thing, they did not try to grow a bigger ox. They used 2 oxen. And I think they're trying to tell us something. When we need greater computer power, the answer is not get a bigger computer, it's get another computer, which of course is what common sense would have told us to begin with. Incidentally, common sense is a legitimate scientific technique. The mathematician Polya, who worked at Princeton, he's the man who wrote the 2-volume text on techniques of problem solving. He also wrote a nice little anchor paperback, How to Solve It. And one entire chapter is devoted to the use of common sense in solving problems. Yet we sometimes forget to use it. So the answer is that to get the computer power we're going to need, we're going to have to build systems of computers. Of course, the first answer anybody will give you to that is that'll cost too much, but it won't anymore. The cheapest complete computer you can buy today is probably the old Intel 8021, the first of the 4-bit computers on a chip. 64 words of data storage, 1,000 words of program storage. Those are down to 13 cents a piece if you buy 100 of them. There's nothing to stop us from building systems of computers. Of course, I walked into one difficulty the minute I proposed the idea. I decided that if I was going to have systems of computers, I'd need 3-dimensional flowcharts. So I got some plastic plates, and I could draw charts on each one and pile them up, looked like 3-dimensional chess. When I connected between the plates, I used little pieces of string and Scotch tape, but they fell off. Finally, I remembered Tinker Toy and got a nice Tinker Toy set, and it had square things and round things and sticks to put them together, and I started building 3-dimensional flowcharts. But I ran out of pieces, so I wrote out a requisition for 2 large Tinker Toy sets. 2 days later, here's the boss. Well, Grace, what are we doing now? I have a better suggestion for you today. Get some of those sets the chemists use to show you molecules. Red balls can be computers, blue balls can be databases, yellow balls database managers, green balls switches, and you can build a model of a system of computers and how they communicate and which ones are connected to which others. And you're going to have to get out of the plane of the paper. You can't draw them on flat paper anymore. They've got to be in 3 dimensions. And you're going to have to explain to people what these systems of computers are doing. And I think the best solution is get one of those chemistry sets if you can. Of course, you may have to explain why you're ordering one, but at least I've warned you what happens when you ask for such things out of the thin air. So we'll build systems of computers. Truth of the matter is, it's already happening. I have one chip here. The chip is made by Hughes. The system's being built by Goodyear Aerospace for NASA. This particular chip has 8 processors on it. They're lined up 4 and 4. You may want to look at it afterwards. I'll have it here. There are 8 processors on that chip. The system consists of 128 by 128 processors, 16,384 processors all in one system. They call it the multiple parallel processor. Now, of course, you might think that's going to fill a room like Mark I did. Not at all. All the processors are in one cabinet. Second cabinet holds all the input, output, and controls. Third cabinet is a PDP 1134. Because obviously you have to have a computer if you're going to manage 16,000 computers. Each pixel from a Landsat photograph will go to one processor. Pixel includes position, color, intensity, everything else that you know about that pixel, and can communicate with the surrounding pixels. It's to be used to hunt for oil and minerals and stuff like that there. The other chip I have here is the first I've managed to get my hands on of the very large-scale integration. I have no doubt that there are more of them in some of our classified things in weapon systems, But this one's out in the open. 3 of these chips form the micro mainframe. 3 chips to form a mainframe computer. When you look at it, you'll find that the microprocessor is just one of the processors on this. It has built-in multi-programming, all the other fancy things. The micro mainframe. We're beginning to be able to build systems of computers. And the sooner we start doing it, the better we can respond to the need for rapid response and rapid development of things. Now, we're not going to get there overnight. We can't suddenly throw out all of our big dinosaurs and replace them with systems of computers. It'll have to be a step-by-step procedure. I'd like to show you something about how we can get at this sort of concept. This is my horrible example. It's a DOD system, not Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, or Coast Guard, DOD. That's different. They went out and bought themselves a 256K computer. And of course, they were going to put great big problems on it. Along came the manufacturer and said, you can't run that thing without an operating system. So they loaded in an operating system, of which 35K is resident at all times. The rest out on disk, you call it in when you need it. Well, they didn't want it to take naps or rest, so they said we better multi-program it. So in went a multi-programming system, of which 28K is resident at all times. Some of you may recognize which computer this is, but don't mention it out loud. It's a rather well-known one. Then they wanted to hang terminals on it so they could ask questions and put in programs, so they had to have time sharing. 35K plus 2K for each of 6 terminals, for a total of 47K for time sharing. Then they wanted communications. They wanted to talk telephone lines, so that was 10K, not too bad. Then they had to have security. So far, we are doing very, very badly on the score of security. We're doing a very poor job, not only in government, but in industry, at protecting valuable information and protecting against fraud and theft. I think mostly people forget how many reasons there are for security. First, of course, there's national security, but we'll leave that to you and the Department of Defense. There's company security, company confidential information that has to be protected. Do you realize there have already been cases where companies have listened to each other's microwave when they were bidding competitively on projects? That's not only not very nice, it's illegal. Then there's the question of personal security, personal information. You realize there have already been cases where people accessed personal information and used it to blackmail people? That is also illegal. And then there's fraud and theft. And regrettably, it's increasing. I lecture in the white collar and computer crime course down at the FBI Academy. I asked them if they had a message they wanted me to give people, and I've been spreading it all around the country. They said, please tell people if their system is broken, let us know. We've got to know what's happening. They showed me the case. A man in a bank, an officer of a bank, stole a large amount of money using the computer. He was discovered and he was fired. But the bank didn't want the stockholders and depositors to know they'd lost all that money, so they covered it up. So he threatened to go to the newspapers unless they gave him a letter of recommendation. And they did. He went to a second bank. He stole a large amount of money. It was discovered, he was fired, and he blackmailed him for a letter of recommendation. It wasn't until he got to the third bank that it was reported to the FBI, as it should have been in the very beginning. The failure to report was very, very costly. They also showed me another case. We haven't been telling our youngsters that it is not funny to use other people's computer time and to erase other people's data. A youngster out in Kansas City broke the network of a software house that was providing services to other companies. He got tired of playing with it, so he sent a message through the network to the managers at the network. And he said, I have all of your access codes, and he listed them. I have all of your personal ID codes, and he listed them and who they belong to. Then he said, I'll tell you how I did it, and I'll promise never to do it again if you'll give me a red Chevette equipped with a radio telephone and please fill it with gasoline. The FBI got him. Then there was the case, it was in the Washington, New York papers. Canada Cement Lafarge found that someone was not only using their computer but wiping out their data. So they called in the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in Bell of Canada, and the calls were traced to the border. They called in the FBI in Mother Bell, and the calls were traced to the Dalton School in New York City. The offenders turned out to be 4 12-year-old boys, now known as the Dalton Gang. So I said to the FBI, well, what are you going to do with all these youngsters? And they muttered about juvenile delinquents. I said, oh, don't do that. Make them work for us. They might be able to make the worldwide military command and control system work. Certainly throughout industry, I have found major difficulties in security. I was tickled to pieces with a New England insurance company out in Portland, Maine. They looked at their data, and they said, hey, we've got 2 databases here, not one big one. All of this information deals with our policyholders. This information deals with how we run our company. We need 2 database machines, which have different classifications, so to speak. People are beginning to look at the data and how you're going to protect it. But so far, well, this system has been broken about every 2 weeks or so, so the security is still growing, 17K for security. Then we're all lemmings in this business. If anybody has something, we all have to have it. So, of course, they had to have a database management system. In went a database management system, 23K. For a total of 160K of overhead, pure overhead. That minor earthquake they had up in New England did not come from the Laurentian Fault. When my sainted Scots grandfather heard about this, he rolled over in his grave. 160K for overhead. That left them with 96K to put their programs in. But they couldn't write a 96K program because they were multi-programming, so they had to have at least 3 partitions in there. Programmers are limited to 32K per program, and ain't that ducky. You buy a 256K computer, you can write a 32K program. Have you looked at your overhead lately? Let's get rid of it. Let's start building a system of computers. Let's put in one microcomputer and have it handle all internal consoles and security, another one and have it handle all external consoles and security. Now I've begun to protect my system. This is my operating system. If I can access your operating system, I'll break your system. If you want to know how to do it, I'll tell you too afterwards. Now I put micros out front. A terminal calls in. The micro asks for the ID of the person operating the terminal, and you give it. The micro breaks the connection and calls back the terminal on which that ID is legal. Now why go through a callback procedure? Look at those kids calling in. They got the telephone number of Canada Cement Lafarge. They called in. The microcomputer asks for an ID. You give an ID. Now it's either you either borrowed, stolen, copied, or bought someone's ID, and all those have already occurred. You give it. Micro breaks the connection. It'll never call back the illegal terminal. And short of piggybacking or an actual wiring within the building, you don't get over that. It has another advantage in that either the micro or the mainframe can change the number of the terminal number, so that you may know your access number, but you do not know the number assigned to your terminal because it may have been changed 2 minutes ago. And it's a fairly good way. I wish more of the banks were using it, the callback procedure, because it's much easier to keep people out of a system to begin with than it is to get them out after they've gotten in. Now let's put a third micro in and have it handle the database. Database manager. That concept has a long and interesting history and is a good example of the way we do not accept new ideas. It was first proposed by Bell Labs in 1972, and they showed that a back-end computer went faster and cost less to manage the data. Nobody paid any attention. In 1974, they published a paper, Back-End Computer for Database Management. I can't believe people read it. Nobody did anything about it. Usually we listen to Bell Labs. 1977, the Army, working with Kansas State University in Cullinan, put a back-end computer for database management. Showed it went faster and cost less, but even they're not doing it. 3 years ago at the National Computer Conference at Anaheim, they showed the first of the database machines, a machine built to do database management. It's not a computer, it doesn't compute, except to count one once in a while, a database manager. People didn't pay attention. Finally, this year, 10 years after we first latched onto the idea, The Navy's putting a database machine in at Point Magoo. And I have a paper here by Frank Malabarba, Database Machines, It's About Time. I can't understand why it's taken us so long to realize that a better specialized machine to handle database was always going to go faster than a general purpose machine. Plus the fact that the minute you go to database machines, you can have more than one database. And in a Navy installation, we could have one database which was highly classified and another one which was open. And it means that more than one computer can access the database. So the concept of database machine is very much at the heart of building the systems of computers of the future and the concept of multiple databases. And that was why I was so happy with that New England insurance company that recognized that right in front of them there was clearly two separate databases, one for the insured and one for their own company. And if we look at our data, we'll find in most cases that it does break down pretty clearly. After all, there was never any reason why we put inventory and payroll on the same computer. The only reason we did was because we only had one computer. Now we've got to overcome that concept and realize those can be on separate computers. And of course, the minute we get to systems of computers, we don't go down anymore, which is another important point. Now I can put 3 more computers in here, 4, 5, and 6, to run those 3 problems that I wanted to run. They'll run in parallel instead of sequentially under multi-programming. And today they can be 64K micro instead of 32K. Next week, of course, they'll be 256K or something. I can put another micro in so they can all talk to each other. It'll cost me less than 1/3 what the big system did. So the sooner I move to systems of computers, the faster I'm going to go, the better security I'll have, and the less it'll cost me. All good reasons for moving toward systems of computers. But it won't happen overnight. Only recently have we persuaded our admiral to send out the order to all of the NORDACs. Identify the first system you're going to pull off and put on a separate computer. Maybe by the time our big mainframes are about to pass out, we will have begun to get our things into a system of computers. It means looking ahead. It means planning ahead. And it's going to take us the next 5 to 10 years to get there. And it's awfully hard to get somebody to do it on their watch when the payoff will not come this year. But we've got to begin to look ahead and plan for the systems of computers of the future. And I hope at least one of you will get a set of those nice gadgets they use in chemistry and start constructing a system of computers. And you can even have different kinds of bonds between them, one of which you know is classified, the other's not, and so on and so forth. I think you'll have lots of fun starting to design the systems of computers of the future. Well, so far I've talked only about data and hardware. We've got to do something about software. One of the big cries today is that software costs too much and you can't maintain it. Combination of a proof by Dr. Haney and my crew, we developed a technique which has paid off in a rather big way, particularly from the point of view of maintaining a system. Now, Dr. Haney proved something rather interesting. You may want to repeat it to your programmers. It's very good for them. Programmers tend to believe something that's mathematical. So if you can get a mathematical proof, they're much more apt to believe it than all the orders in creation. Dr. Haney said, suppose I have a piece of a program and I make a change in it. Do I have enough programmers here to know what happens when you do that? You probably have to make another change. The darn things ripple. All right, he said, let P be the probability that if I make a change, it causes another change. Then he said, I'd like to know, on the average, how many changes do I have to make as a result of that first change? Well, that's the expected value. The statisticians have told us how to compute it. E is the first change, plus the second change times the probability that I have to make it, P. But sometimes the second change causes a third change, P squared. Sometimes a third causes a fourth, P cubed. It's the infinite series. But probability is always 1 or less. So the mathematicians have told me that in that case, the sum of that series is 1 over 1 minus P. So if I have some real good applications programmers, if the chances if they make a change is going to be 1 in 10 that they'll have to make another change, this becomes 1 over 1 minus a tenth, 1 over 9 tenths, 1.111111, which looks like something I can live with. But I practically never have a system which consists of only one module. So now let's have another module. And now I'll behave like a normal mathematician. This is the ith module, and this is the jth module. And now Pij is the probability that if we make a change in the ith module, it'll cause a change in the jth module. I change something in the selector, it upsets the I/O. Now I'd like to know how many changes do I expect to make as a result of that first change? Now, incidentally, we've run into that more than once. I've known cases where they made one change, it caused 30 changes, that caused about 500 changes, and at that point they decided they better throw it away and start over again. In this case, Dr. Haney's proof shows that in this case, the expected value turns out to be 1 over 1 minus NP, where P is the probability that a change in one module will cause a change in another one, and N's the number of modules. Now let N, suppose I have 100 modules in this system. It's an operating system or a database management system or a great big application. And now I have systems programmers, who are much better, of course, than applications programmers. So now the probability that they make a change that's going to cause another change is 1 in 100. How many changes will I expect to make as a result of that first change? This should be a minus sign, I'm sorry. 1 over 1 minus 100 times 100th is 1, which is 1 over 0, which is infinity, and the system will not stabilize. We've been awful close to that point. You can probably all remember cases where we changed something in the I/O, and a week later the whole system blew up, and you didn't know where it started from. Is there an answer to it? And the answer is yes, there is. That is to make all of the Pij's 0. Well, what's that mean? It means you write the system in independent modules. Modules such they have one entrance point and one exit point. And no module ever accesses the interior of any other module. Never touches it. And the way you exchange data between the modules is through a series of interfaces. This module puts something down, another module picks it up. I asked my crew to build me a COBOL compiler for the 8K ruggedized Nova. Of course, everybody knew you couldn't do that, but they did. I asked them to build it entirely in independent modules, and they developed a technique which I found extremely useful, and so did they. They had a microcomputer. They kept all of the modules on the microcomputer as a file. So anytime anybody wanted to look at one of the independent modules, he could call it up and look at it. They also kept a file of the interfaces. By the number of the interface, the contents of the interface, and who was in charge of the interface, followed by a list of the other modules and who was in charge of it. So if anybody wanted to change an interface, he could immediately find out who he had to check with before he could change that interface. And they didn't have that awful case if you change something over here and it blows up over here next week. They had the modules themselves and the interfaces completely under control. They were in the microcomputer, and at any given moment, any one of them could look at them. And one second class petty officer, 2 third class, and 1 seaman in 4 months' time built a COBOL compiler. That's normally 2 years. They did a magnificent job. And part of it, I think, was the fact that they had the file of the modules and the interfaces to work with. Also, when they were transferred and a new group came in, the documentation was complete for them to add to it, to change it, because any module could be pulled out without affecting any other module. All you had to check were those interfaces. And there was a complete record of those interfaces. So maybe there's something we can think about toward easier building of systems of software and of managing not only the software development itself, but also the maintenance. Well, it finally got to be 1966, and I got a letter from the Chief of Naval Personnel. And the first paragraph said, "You have completed 23 years in the reserves, which is more than 20. And I knew that. The second paragraph was also aimed right at me. It said, "You have attained age 60. I knew that, too. The third paragraph said, "Here are the blanks. Please apply for retirement." So I did. And I was officially placed on the Naval Reserve retired list with the rank of commander on the 31st of December, 1966. The saddest day of my life. I left out one thing. Going back to that course I had from the War College, the second review I was to review the cost of not doing something. Now, we did that for all the islands. We looked at the cost in men and material of taking an island. Then we looked at the consequences of bypassing the island. And some we took, like Saipan and Tinian. Others we bypassed, like Truk. That study was always made. What is the cost of not doing this? I've long advocated the use of the standard high-level languages. And I'd go to one of our data processing installations and say, why aren't you using standard COBOL instead of all those bells and whistles the vendor gives you? Oh, we get a few extra bits and bytes or something like that, or microseconds. I said, have you looked at the cost when you go to the next computer? Cost of conversion? Well, we'll think about that later. I finally decided that I had to find somebody that would really scare people. So I looked around Washington to see which agency really did scare people. And I decided it was the General Accounting Office. That's because they come and look at everything you're doing and then go tell Congress about it. So I went over to GAO and said, do you realize how much it's costing us not to use the standard high-level languages? And they said no. They made a year-long study. The answer they came up with was rather interesting. They said that between that time and 1985, about 8,500 of the general management computers in the total federal inventory would be replaced. And furthermore, that the cost of conversion was running $450 million a year. $450 million a year down the drain simply because we had failed to implement the standards. Money we could have had for all the things we wanted to do, and far outweighed anything we saved by using the special bells and whistles that any vendor gave us. That was a case where most people totally failed to look at the cost of not doing something. They'd tell me that, oh, well, they couldn't possibly enforce the standards this year. They'd have to get new forms. They'd have to beat all the programmers over the head. They'd do the standards bit next year. And they wouldn't look at the cost of not using the standards. So that review goes right up along with the all possible enemy actions, the cost of not carrying out the action. Well, finally they retired me on 31 December 66. Thanks to our highly automated pension system, I got my first pension check on the 1st of April. 2 weeks later, I got a call from the Pentagon, come down to Washington, we want to talk to you. So I came a-running, as I always do when the Navy sends for me. I had to wait in Mr. Ream's outer office. There were 2 captains there. Naturally, since I was only a commander, I spoke to them very pleasantly and respectfully. However, inadvertently, I managed to tell those 2 men, my aunt, the captain's young nowadays. One of them turned out to be my new commanding officer, so I started on the right foot. Mr. Ream took one look at me and said, the Navy payroll's been written 823 times, this has got to stop. So naturally I said, yes, sir. It ended up he asked me to return to active duty with a job of standardizing the high-level languages and getting the whole Navy to use them. I noticed how the first half of that job was finite, the second was infinite. But I'd be very glad to make a start on it. And so I reported on the 1st of August, 1967, on 6 months temporary active duty. And so far, it is the longest 6 months I've ever spent in my entire life. As for Navy personnel, they gave me 2 Navy men, DP3s, a civilian and a secretary, an office in the 5th deck of the Pentagon, that's the attic, slant roof, escalators go to the 4th deck, and you hike to the 5th. They gave us each a desk and a chair and a pad and a pencil. Standardize the high-level languages, start with COBOL. No cards, no tapes, no computer, and no budget. Well, since I was initiating a new Navy activity, the first thing I did was go out and buy a coffee urn. The second thing I did was teach my new crew the things the chief had taught me during World War II. And I'd like to assure you that our new Navy men and women are just as good as any World War II man ever was. It only took them 2 weeks to completely furnish the office. The only day we nearly got in trouble, they turned up with a coffee table like they have down in the secretary's office. The captain took one look at it and said, "Where'd you get that?" But I remembered what to do. I just stood perfectly straight and said, "Captain, it wasn't bolted down." So that became one of our mottos: if it isn't bolted down, bring it home. In fact, we did so well that the junior officers at NAVCOSAC eventually gave us our own flag. It's a beautiful nylon boat flag with grommets and everything on a pole beside my desk. And it's a skull and crossbones. And to the best of my knowledge, we were the only office ever in the entire Pentagon to openly fly the Jolly Roger and operate under its aegis. Of course, I also taught my crew that when we go out to get something, always liberate from the Air Force first, because they have everything and don't know how much they got. Second, if you can't get it that way, try the Army, because they have almost everything and they can't count. And there's no use trying to liberate anything from the Seabees or the Marines, because they liberated it to begin with. We survived, one way or another, on no budget. We had no money to buy computer time. We lived on the slack in the Pentagon computers. No good chief operator will ever schedule a computer 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. He leaves 5 minutes here, 10 there, 15 there, for the things that happen when you operate systems of computers. If he didn't need his slack time, my crew made friends with every chief operator of the Pentagon. I never knew how they got in some places, and I didn't ask. They'd call us and say, can you use 5 minutes? Can you use 10 minutes? That meant our programs had to run on anybody's computer, because everybody knew you couldn't do that. Except my crew didn't know you couldn't do that. One third-class petty officer wrote a program, low-level COBOL. It asks you which computer you're on. You can say anything from Apple to Amdahl, 370, 3500, whatever you got your hands on. And as it enters the remainder of the program, it enters the control cards and special names, and you run that computer. And you can write programs that'll run on anybody's computer. And the entire sets of test routines for both COBOL and Fortran compilers have been run on everybody's computers. There's no excuse for not writing programs that are portable. Well, that solved our problem of computer time. And we began to develop the test routines, first for COBOL, later for Fortran. 2.5 years later, I was invited to give a presentation for the Secretary of the Navy. It was going to be the Secretary of the Navy, Assistant Secretary, Chief of Naval Operations, Chief of Naval Materiel, all the Vice Admirals. Oh, they rehearsed me for 2 weeks ahead of time. I went through one dry run after another till I was letter perfect. We finally got to the great morning, and I was walking down the corridor beside the executive corridor beside the captain. He looks down at me and says, first time a woman ever gave a presentation in that room. That was so I'd feel more at ease, more comfortable. He let me get about 10 feet further, and he says, first time anybody below the rank of captain ever gave a presentation in that room. He had me in good shape when I got there. So the first thing I did was break from the speech and tell the secretary it was just as well we hadn't had a budget. Because if we had had one, I'd still be filling out the papers to get our first hour of computer time. But I managed to get through to the end, and he was a charming gentleman. He thanked me, he congratulated me, and then he said, is there anything we can do to help you? Now, I hadn't been briefed on how to respond to that question, so naturally I waded right in and said, yes, I wanted 2 more DPs, 2 more programmers, and $20,000 to survey the users of COBOL to find out what they needed next. He said he'd see what he could do about it, and that whole room collapsed in one roar of laughter. Boy, did I get out the door. I looked at the captain and said, well, what did I do this time? He said, don't you realize nobody ever asked for less than $20 million in that room before? So we got 2 more DPs and $20,000, only to run into a major problem with our DPs in the Pentagon. We found there was a large number of civilians and even some officers who were not about to listen to a young man or woman who wore a sailor suit. It got so bad that the captain finally said, we will have to take them out of uniform. I don't think I ever regretted anything more than the day I had to tell those youngsters, take off your uniforms so that people will listen to you. I tried to make up for it. I personally paid for having cards printed for each one of them with a Navy seal on it, and I made them all managers. Mr. George N. Baird, Manager, Test and Evaluation. Boy, that had a marvelous effect on the civilians. They're very respectful of managers. It even had a good effect on some of the officers, particularly Army. I find we have a very bad habit of underestimating our young people. I think we totally fail to recognize how much more they know than we knew at the same age. I can make the comparison. They've had radio and television all their lives long for both information and misinformation. I didn't have a radio set till I was a senior in high school. I built a crystal set. I didn't have a vacuum tube set till I was a senior in college. It was the year whose superheterodyne circuit first came out. I knew man would never walk on the moon. They know he has. They know all about jet airplanes. They can't remember their first flight in an airplane. They were taken on a jet to visit their grandparents when they were babies. I didn't fly in an airplane till I was a sophomore in college. I spent $10, and that was a heck of a lot of money in 1925. I went up in an open cockpit biplane built out of wood and linen and wire. And it went up about 150 feet and floated along about 80 miles an hour. I'd be scared to death to go near it today. They know all about jets. I was reminded of this not long ago because I was walking out to take Allegheny's itty-bitty commuter flight from Washington to Philadelphia. I guess it's Ransom Airlines now. And there was a young man beside me. He was looking up at that plane. Finally, he turned to me and he said, "Is that thing safe?" And I said, "Yeah, why not?" He said, "I've never flown in a prop plane before." We have a whole generation that's never flown in prop planes. We've totally forgotten how much more they know than we knew at the same age. On the other hand, they're no more mature than we were at the same age. And they're looking for something which they cannot always put in words. And I've seen it across the country as I've talked at schools and colleges and to our young people. What they're looking for is positive leadership. I mean leadership in the old Navy sense. It's a two-way street. It's loyalty up and loyalty down. It's respect for your superior and keep him informed of what you're up to, and take care of your crew. We've forgotten that. We think leadership only comes from some guy up there at the top. It's everybody's job. It's everybody's job to take care of their crew. For example, I decided that the youngsters coming through my group, that every one of them should be able to get on his feet and give a report and not once say, "You know." So I put a little square box on their desk with a slot in it, and if they said "you know" during a report, they had to put a quarter in. Now, we didn't take the quarters, but it tied up their capital. And you'd be surprised how fast they learned not to say "you know." I also decided that every one of them must be able to write a report and correct English statements and spell all the words correctly. I bought 5 dictionaries. It also meant a lot of extra time for me with the red ink at nights and weekends and then explaining for the changes. Yet before they left, every single one of those 50 or so youngsters was able to give orally and in writing a correct report in good English and spell all the words correctly. I think we forget that the 4- and 5-year-olds are learning arithmetic, the little professor. The 6-year-olds are getting speak and spell. You better look out, there's going to be a generation coming that'll know how to spell. The 7-year-olds, of course, are learning basic, running the computers. I know one man that bought a computer and took it home. His son is teaching him basic. His son's 7. Of course, I know another guy that took a computer home. Now he has to apply to his 3 children for computer time. They're tremendously bright, and they're out there, the brightest youngsters we have ever had. Now, they're not coming from the 2 coasts and the big cities. They're coming from farm country where they still believe you have to work to earn something and work to learn something. North Dakota, South Dakota, Idaho, Wyoming, Utah, Nebraska, Kansas, Kentucky, Tennessee, northern Alabama, northern Georgia, southern Indiana, southern Illinois, West Texas. They're coming from out there in the farm country where they still have good schools. And they still believe you have to work to learn something. They're out there, the brightest we have ever had. And yet somewhere in the last 30 years, we lost that word leadership. We went overboard for management, partly under the influence of Mr. McNamara, partly under the business schools. We concentrated on this quarter's bottom line, this year's fitness report. We forgot to look ahead for the next 5 years for any enterprise. And we lost that concept of leadership. Loyalty up and loyalty down. It's the one thing those youngsters are looking for. You can't do it all by management. If I had a Marine standing here beside me, what he would say would be, when the going gets rough, you cannot manage a man into combat. You must lead him. And I think he would further add, you manage things. You lead people. We need to bring that back very badly, not only in the armed forces, but in all of government, throughout business and industry. It's the one thing that those youngsters are really looking for. Good, positive leadership. Well, eventually, The test routines were successful. The order went out which said all compilers brought into the inventory of the Department of Defense should be tested. You Navy shall set up a compiler testing service, which was done, and we started testing all Fortran and COBOL compilers for the Department of Defense. That left the rest of the federal government to worry about. National Bureau of Standards came and got a copy of our programs. We were glad to share them until 2 weeks later. Our programs had been printing out at the top of every page of every report, U.S. Navy compiler test. I found them loose in Washington, and they were printing out NBS compiler test, and boy, was I mad. They came around and wanted a new updated set of the programs, and I said I wouldn't give them one. I was promptly told that politically I must cooperate with the National Bureau of Standards. So I thought it over for 2 whole days. And I finally gave them a new set of the programs, and as I did, I promised them if they again attempted to change U.S. Navy into NBS, it would blow their operating system off their computer. Well, eventually we held a peace conference and exchanged our prisoners of war. And the National Bureau of Standards delegated to the Navy the job of testing all COBOL and Fortran compilers for the entire federal government. That continued till about 2.5 years ago. At that time, the Appropriations Committee of the House of Representatives made a horrifying discovery. They discovered, to their horror, that the Navy was performing a federal function. In their completely horrified state, they picked the compiler testing service out of the Navy and put it over in the General Services Administration. Now, I might be real worried about them over there, except I trained them all. They're all ex-Navy. I think they're doing all right. Since they got over there, they've gotten all new offices, all new furniture, and 2 new computers. Every 3 months, they put out a certified compiler list, which lists all compilers which have been tested and certified to meet the ANSI specifications, all the way from Apple to Amdahl and everything in between. And there is a COBOL for Apple, and it has passed the standards test. For both COBOL and Fortran, they're all listed, and you can even get the details of the test. Most of them cost around $8 or $9 for the complete details of the test of any given compiler. So, at last, we're beginning to be able to implement the standard high-level languages. I'm tremendously proud of what those youngsters have accomplished. 2 of them received the Navy Achievement Award for leading the development of those test routines. One received the Navy Achievement Award for leading the development of the COBOL compiler for the 8K ruggedized Nova. We're particularly proud of one member of the group. She finished her courses. She was a second-class petty officer, so we shipped her off to OCS. She's now in a cruise missile installation in Germany, a lieutenant, and she has just been selected to attend the Naval Postgraduate School. For myself, I've probably spent the busiest, most exciting, most challenging, and most interesting 15 years I've ever spent in my entire life, and I've loved every single minute of it. I've also received most of the honors that are given to anyone in the computer industry. Each time I've received one, I've thanked them, and then I've told them something I'd like to repeat to you. I have already received the highest award I will ever receive, no matter how long I live, no matter how many more jobs I may have. And that has been the privilege and the responsibility of serving very proudly in the United States Navy. Thank you all, and don't forget to get a nanosecond.